Hello everyone, welcome to the London School of Economics and to one of our newer rooms, the Parish Hall rooms. My name's Peter Bryant, I'm the Head of Learning Technology and Innovation here at the school, and welcome to our final NetworkED for 2015. And it's with great pleasure that we are presenting a panel about a project that started here at the school in late last year and ran quite intensively through until around about April this year, called Constitution UK. But what we are primarily going to talk about is not the project itself will be a critical part of this, but for us it's actually what the project sort of bore out and some of the sort of things that we didn't really expect to find when this thing started to run. So I will introduce our panel and then I'll just give a sort of brief little sort of context for this. We do actively encourage you to tweet through our LSE NetED hashtag. This is being live streamed and it is being recorded and it will be put up on the web fairly soon. So let me introduce our panel. I shall start right here. And we have Professor Conor Geraghty, who is, as you can see on the screen there, the Director of the Institute of Public Affairs and also a Professor of Human Rights Law here at the LSE and was the project lead for Constitution UK. We have Darren Moon, who's a Senior Learning Technologist with Learning Technology and Innovation, the LSE. And we have Paul Sullivan, who is also from the Institute of Public Affairs and is the Institute Manager.
Correct.
So what I want to do is just put a bit of context around this before we bring the panel in. So what sort of started this is the idea that a lot of modern pedagogy and civic engagement is actually quite scaffolded. It's quite structured, it's quite sequential, it's quite aligned, it's quite stratified. We do things in particular orders, and that's whether you are talking about learning or if you're talking about any forms of sort of democratic civic engagement. And they are often done in that way because there's the idea that you need to learn to crawl before you can walk. There are, particular literacies and skills that you need to develop in order to participate in these processes. Unfortunately, a lot of what we do in our life doesn't have those things. And it is actually the sort of living, learning, sharing, connecting, acquiring, challenging and changing. Those things are not always particularly sequential and they happen out of order. So for us, the question we pose to start all of this is what if engagement, not just learning, but democracy and civic engagement could actually be informal, community-led, non-linear, democratic, problem-solving, collaborative, chaotic, aspirational, emancipatory and open? What if those things could drive the way civic engagement and learning occur? And all at a massive scale. And all using social media. That was the context that I came into the Institute of Public Affairs in late last year with that particular challenge put to them. And in that context, we came up with the notion, or they saw that there was a connection between that and a project they were running called Crowdsourcing the UK Constitution. Not a small project in and of itself. The idea that the crowd, the community, could develop the Constitution for the United Kingdom. This was a bigger project for the IPA. This was their third stage of it, from a previous online version and a constitutional convention held here at the school, just actually outside here. For us, it was looking at how we could approach this problem in a different way. And I'm sure both Paul and Conor will talk about some of the backgrounds of this. We wanted to look at ways we could integrate participatory practices, engage individuals and groups. What we were really keen on doing was ensuring it wasn't a traditional course. This wasn't a course in constitutional law. This was something that didn't have traditional readings and groups. There was no lecturer, no teacher. There may have been a guru on the course. I was pointing at Conor and he didn't know it. And there was no particular sequence. We didn't want people, if they didn't participate in week one, to say that they could never participate again. Because that kind of is not the way democracy works. What we also found from the people who were involved in this is that because the LSE were involved, learning was a bit of an expectation. They think they were going to learn. So you bring the sort of both sides of the expectation. The last thing I just want to give the context, and you'll get a lot more of this as we go through, is at the end, aside from crowdsourcing a constitution, so I've sort of given you the sort of crying game ending already, we had 1,500 users, 725 idea submissions, 125,000 idea views, 10,000 comments, 25,000 votes, an 8,500 word constitution, and over 1 million words written on the platform. So it was quite a successful project.
In 14 weeks.
In 14 weeks. Sorry, I forgot that last bit. So what I will do now is I'm going to ask each of my panel members here to, in about 2 minutes each, describe their Constitution UK experience. So I'm going to start with Connor.
Right, I've got 2 minutes. First, a bit of background. I'm a sort of routine academic. I've been here for years, before that King's, before that Cambridge. So I'm sort of one of the regular teachers and writers of books and so on. But I've long hankered after reaching a wider audience. So as long ago as 2000, that's 15 years ago, I did a CD set on the Human Rights Act with John Naughton, a friend of mine. It didn't sell, but it showed a kind of willing because it was video, audio, and written. And then, not so long ago, maybe 4 years ago, I did a book on the web, serialized book. So I've formed in the field of outreach, and I got this new job here running this institute that Paul manages. And for me, it was an opportunity to experiment with the wider community. I'd initially thought about a MOOC, I think is the fashionable word, but Peter was brilliant in persuading me, together with Darren, about looking at things in a slightly different and fresher way. And so I came to the Constitution issue not just because I'm a public lawyer, but because it was a way of doing something, as it were, beyond MOOCs, more instant than MOOCs. And what I took from it was the value of the connection between the academic side and the technology side. That was really valuable. You guys gave us a platform and we delivered content, but we were connected up and together and complementary, not fighting against each other. So guru or no guru, the thing became an opportunity to communicate more broadly than we would have done with colleagues many more than me. And the Constitution at the end was a kind of detail. We'll talk some more about that. But the value lay on the process. The two earlier periods were, I'm slightly over the two, I'll take another 30 seconds, were an open meeting where we had 400 people engaged with real people, but used technology to vote about a constitution. And the second was a carnival, which we had here, using unconventional ways of communicating with academics. So this was the third, as you rightly said, Peter, in a phase of innovation. The constitution was secondary to process. The value of it lay in the capacity we had to reach people who were hitherto unreachable to us. Brought home to me, final point, by sitting in the LSE studio with colleagues, Andrew Blick, I think, from King, Simon Hicks from LSE, taking real live questions via Twitter, being fed back to the people asking, and none of us asking, where are you from, who are you, all of us engaging with the questions on their face. No prior kind of status, financial statement required. And that was a really exciting moment.
Cool. Thank you, Connor. Darren?
As a learning technologist here at the LSE, I suppose one of the biggest features of our world over the last few years has been the rise of the MOOC, and the school so far has not chosen to partner with any of the major platform providers, and which is not to say we're not engaged with the MOOC space. We most certainly are, but we view it at the moment from very much from a critical perspective rather than being an active part of it. When this project came our way, this to me seemed like a perfect opportunity to take on a bit of activity which allows us to test some of the assumptions, contest some of the norms of MOOC delivery, and to do so in a way which was very, very timely, with the alignment of the 800th anniversary of the Magna Carta, the Scottish independence referendum, and the general election in May. From my personal experience, I just feel hugely, hugely grateful to have had the opportunity to work on a project which delivered such a satisfying 14 weeks to so many people. It was incredibly hard work for all of the team involved, but one of the most rewarding experiences I've had professionally, without a shadow of a doubt.
Okay, so unlike Connor not being a long-lived innovator in terms of education, and unlike Darren not having an easy facility and lots of experience with learning technology, my experience of the Constitution Project was different, in that it was a constant effort to stay up to date and to try and rein in and to manage, being the manager, this project, and to try and make sure that everybody actually knew what we were talking about. There's, with something like learning technology, there comes a whole lexicon of terms that, if you're not familiar with them, can be confusing to those both in the project team, but also more broadly. So part of my role and part of my experience was to constantly attempt to understand and define and think about what we meant by terms like gamification when this came up. Why are we doing? What do you mean people are actually incentivized to get points on a website? Who could possibly be interested in that? There's no way this could work. And to add a kind of cynical, but I admit uninformed edge to understanding the Constitution Project. So a more cynical approach, a more need to make sure that when we've got all these high-flying ideas and high-profile academics and thousands of people, we are actually still within budget. We still actually are within in the time frame that we need. So a slightly different approach, or slightly different experience to the other two, but a necessary one, I think, and one that not wanting, obviously trying to be facilitative, but also trying to keep boundaries on what the project was doing and how it was progressing. So interesting as an outsider to learning technology initially, an outsider to the theory and practice underlying it. Hugely interesting. By far the most impressive thing I've ever seen done in the workplace. But at the same time, always trying to keep it within some established parameters in terms of time and budget.
Yep.
Always important.
Always important.
So, to us, I think one of the interesting parts of sort of as a learning technology and higher education community is the notion, and Connor sort of foreshadowed talking about the MOOC. And I think one of the most underexplored letters in the acronym of the MOOC is the massive bit. And what do we actually mean by massive, and does massive actually in many ways simply signify the achievement of the number of people you drew to the platform, or is it actually something that in itself is quite an important concept? So I'm going to ask, I'll start with Darren. Why massive? Why did this need the crowd? Why couldn't this be done by a group of scholars sitting in a room?
Well, it could quite easily have been done by a group of scholars sitting in a room. It just would have been a completely different project output at the end of it. I think from the outset we were very much motivated by this being an external public-facing offering that tried as much as possible to engage a broad demographic from a variety of backgrounds across the UK. It needed to be massive, primarily for the final project output, the written constitution, to have any real validity as a crowdsourced document. You can't crowdsource without a crowd, and that was hugely important. To pick up on your point about the MOOC context. Yes, I mean I am a MOOC skeptic, and but I find it an absolutely fascinating episode in education over the last couple of years. It beguiles me constantly as to how we've ended up where we have. What we absolutely didn't want to do is deliver. We knew very well that if we had tried over 14 weeks to deliver a constitutional 101 with an assignment to crowdsource a written constitution as an assignment in the final 4 or 5 weeks, it almost certainly would have fallen flat on its face. I think what we were excited about was to try and recontextualise what the massive means, and it shouldn't just be a question of the number of registrants that you are successful in getting on an online offering. Massive can mean, in our case, the 1 million word output that participants generated over the 14 weeks. I think that's a far more interesting way of thinking about it in terms of MOOCs. What can a potentially small crowd achieve that is massive, either in terms of their output, their activity, or their impact?
Connor, why was the massive important to you?
The background for me is, again, what I do. And in law, there's a broad division. The vast majority of legal academics are in favour of judicial power. And they believe what judges do is necessarily a good thing. And that is obviously, when you reflect on it, without even building in sociology, an elite position. And my intellectual academic personality has been in opposition to that all my life. So my books have been about democracy and civil liberties, and I'm a kind of anti-lawyer lawyer. So I've believed in the crowd before this project ever came about. And then secondly, reflecting on something you asked Darren, the market for expertise was cornered by UCL and King's, to be pragmatic about it. UCL has historically had very close connections with elite communities and was home to the IPPR, which drafted a written constitution around the end of the Thatcher period, where the great guys got together and developed it and published it. And that was the latest version of what truth was. And more recently, and in King's, there were various men in suits who gathered to work out what the constitution should be, overseen by Sir Bob. You will have met him, Sir Bob Worcester, the sort of honorary Brit, who was in charge of Magna Carta. And I felt LSE should do something a bit different. And the bit different was, and this is the critical thing, to start with no assumptions and to let the crowd drive it. So obviously you have to have something, because you have to have the beginning of a discourse. But from the very start, what is in it is to the guys, men and women. So to me, it was the democratic instinct developed to a new level.
So, Paul, considering you bought the budget and...
Yeah, which makes me sound incredibly boring.
No, not at all.
Can I just say this was interesting?
So, what attracted you to the idea that this could be big? That it could have more people talking about this than other iterations of the project?
Two things. One, if it wasn't big, then we were going to look just a little bit silly, having set out to try and be big.
Yep.
So when you say that we're going to crowdsource Constitution Online, and then you get sort of 28 people, you kind of end up looking a little bit silly, and really it undermines what is actually a very important field of development and learning development, because it undermines, and it could show there is no appetite, public or otherwise, for this kind of activity, and there is, as we've shown. So one reason to be massive is because that was the point. That was why we were there, and we were showing that it could be done. The second one, I think, is important in that in an earlier iteration of the crowdsourcing project, in phase 1, I think, and this was before you guys came on board, we used a system called Lumio to attempt to begin a kind of online discussion of constitutional provisions. And it quite quickly got hijacked by 2 or 3 individuals, or at least individual usernames. They may have been the same person, you never know. Making points that were peripheral, being not quite abusive towards people, nothing that you could ever sort of bar someone from participation on the basis of. But you could think that this would put other people off continuing to be part of it. So massive is necessary actually to give it a self-sustaining quality, and to drown out or to dilute those who have a sort of less interested, less positively engaged attitude towards a project like this. You need a crowd there to make sure that the if I can say, the idiots don't win, if I can put it that way. So
well, I think that leads into an interesting question, because one of the things that, if you talk to a lot of people who are engaged in the MOOC space and in open online learning, there are a number of registration hurdles that are applied to a lot of these things in order to ensure the community is relatively closed. You need to be signed up to see a Future Learn course, for example. Once you leave the Future Learn course, you can't go back in and look at it. It's open in the sense that it's open to you while you're registered, not necessarily open to you after you've finished. This was slightly different. So I'm curious to know from our perspective, say maybe start with Connor, the perspective of what kind of skills did you think people would bring to the platform to be a kind of responsible, or if you will, irresponsible member of this community?
I suppose my primary concern was that there should be people there.
Mm.
This is echoing Paul's point.
Mm.
And then secondly, I was reacting to the elite community in which I usually worked, and so was keen to embrace the different, so was promiscuously democratic about entrance. Now, I've always been temperamentally disinclined to believe that qualifications matter when it comes to thoughtful opinion. So for me, and it's worth saying at this point, we did do a lot of these tours around the country, as well as do it in the studio, as well as do it in the technology way alone. I wasn't really particularly caring about who was presented. Because I was the front man engaging directly, it put an onus on me to draw out the sense from them. But I quite enjoyed that. It's a teaching skill. So the short answer to your question is almost that I was indifferent. Not that I welcomed anarchy, but I felt I could cope with it.
Darren, what was your, having set up, and part of obviously the decisions on choosing some of the technology decisions and pedagogical decisions, what kind of skills did you expect people to bring in or wanted to exhibit in this?
We're starting, or we have started over the last 6 to 12 months to see an increasing body of critical literature around MOOCs emerge. And I think what we can say with a good degree of confidence is that we know the constituency that MOOC provision serves best. And currently, it is those persons with existing undergraduate and postgraduate qualifications, overwhelmingly. There is, I think, one of the things we drew from that is that in being a higher education institution and pitching a typically educational offering that is redolent of the manner in which we deliver our standard undergraduate and postgraduate programs, that you are probably denying yourself access to a whole group of people for whom there is no interest in that kind of offering, for whom there might be certain baggage that they have from their own educational experience, which means they might not go within 100 miles of a project like that. I think there is also, so for me, we were absolutely keen to structure a project which invited as many people in as possible and encouraged as broad a base of contributions as possible to improve the validity of the outcome. We designed this in. So in a funny kind of way, we used the educational strategies that we know to work in the online and blended environments to almost design the education out of the project, so that we dispensed with all the nomenclature of lectures and seminars and assignments and deadlines. That was not a feature of this. It was not going to be a constitutional 101. Equally, nor did we want our community of people to give freely of their time and feel as though they had to aspire to some kind of legalese in their contributions. So it was all about values. It was about engaging people around the issues that they care about and getting them to give us their considered opinion as articulately as they could on the issues that mattered to them. And I think that was key, really.
So, I mean, one of the other interesting parts of a lot of these projects is that they have beginnings and ends. There's a week one, you go through the steps in your week one, you finish your week one, and then you do 2, 3, 4, and then you go out, you might get a badge halfway through. How did this project sort of create a pathway for participants? I'll start with Darren, then we'll move on to Paul.
Okay, so we had, broadly speaking, 4 phases. We started with an open ideation phase, which was an initial 8 weeks, extended to 10 weeks. It was structured around 10 challenge areas, which were determined by the previous incarnation of the Constitution UK project. So there is already we're starting from a foundation of good legitimacy, being based in the previous project. This was everything and the kitchen sink into the hat. I mean, literally people chucking in every single idea that they could. At the end of this phase, we ended up with some 725 unique idea contributions. 29,000 comments around those ideas, huge amount of activity. We motivated our community by clearly laying out for them the timeline of the project. So we would end with our constitutional carnival, at which we would do the final drafting alongside Connor, Paul, ourselves, other LSE experts. And we're moving back from there. We would say we will take the top 20 community champions, so as we so referred to them, and they would be invited to our final event. There was a whole gamification strategy that ran through the project, which awarded people points for their contributions, and we used this as a motivator to bring the crowd along with us, and it worked incredibly well. Yeah. We made an intervention in the final week, and I know there are people in our in our world of educational technology who are sceptical about gamification, and I appreciate some of the arguments there as well. But this worked incredibly well in our context. We had a final voting week where we doubled the points, and we ummed and ahed long and hard, I remember, about whether or not this was the right thing to do. And there were certain limitations of our platform that meant if we were to go ahead with it, certain undesirable effects would be applied. It was a really, really risky moment in the project story. But we did it, and in that final week, we had 3 times as many votes generated, almost twice as many idea submissions as had been accrued in the previous 12 weeks. I mean, it was phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal.
One of the other interesting things, and Paul, you flagged this in talking about the previous iterations, was the trolls. The sort of person who said, okay, we're talking about, should the council be responsible for picking up dog poo? Well, no, that I want a queen. The queen will do that for me. Yeah. I don't know if she will, but she might. You don't know. So in this instance, what did you think was going to happen in terms of this broader church of people? Were you just going to magnify the trolls?
Well, the thing is that trolling is everywhere. You cannot go on a newspaper website which has got a comments section, whether it's the local paper, whether it's a national paper, whether it's any, except where those comments are not immediately moderated out, and find a discussion forum like that where that trolling doesn't take place. Yeah. So it's not a question, it wasn't for me a question of what shall we do if this happens. This is going to happen. How do we patrol it? If we patrol it, how do we moderate this?
This was another really good, robust discussion.
It was another very good, robust discussion, and I'm not sure we agreed, as I recollect. But you had. It doesn't have to be nasty. It doesn't have to be you're stupid. That's a ridiculous idea. Go and crawl back under your stone. People were putting up comments on the first iteration of things like money should be abolished. Separate currency for men and women. Now, and Sniggers, but. Is that the kind of, if there's somebody putting 3 or 4 of those on a day, ideas, quote unquote, like that, is that a forum that other people want to join? Does it look like a serious debate? Whether you're a legal expert or not, or whether you've got sort of, if you have a minimal interest previously but think, hey, this looks interesting, I'll have a look. You see that kind of stuff and you think, what? I'll look at something else. There's loads of stuff out there I could participate in. So the minimum level of participation or prior knowledge is 0, or was 0 for the project, which I think is absolutely right, and that's the democratic way. But at the same time, there is participation which has to be in some way managed and by the crowd, and I think we've struck the right balance. But it's
the solution we came up with in the end was pretty graceful and did deliver for us. I mean, it was a real concern. I mean, I think I remember when we were talking it through in the early stages, and this was very much an early decision before the project launch. It's very easy to think that we will inevitably get railroaded. That it's going to be very, very hard for us to avoid. Well, what I think with a project like this is of concern is you have a number of very passionate and active single interest groups, any one of whom could enter a project like this and pull it off in a single direction and completely skew the experience for everyone else that's part of the community. My colleague who can't be here today, Chris Fryer, it was his suggestion that perhaps we could mitigate this risk by just inviting all of these people in, which at the time sort of took us all kind of by surprise. But actually, as we debated it, it sort of made a lot more sense. So rather than sort of thinking about all of these policies and procedures we could put in place to deal with problems as after the fact, the project team, Noita and Daniel, sent out some 430 emails to single interest groups across the UK saying, we'd love you to be part of this project. Can you give us a short 500-word statement? We'd love to feature it on the platform. And in doing that, I think we sort of cut that risk right down.
Yeah, but it opens another risk. In the same time as doing that, it opened another risk in that we've then got great representation from a broad range of special interest groups. But how does an individual who might be interested even find the project?
Yes,
because most people think, I'm really interested in the Constitution. I wonder if there's a crowdsourcing platform somewhere where I can go and participate. It's not a natural train of thought. So another challenge was actually to get the message out there to individuals, not just interest groups, who might want to participate and to find a way to draw them into the project. Because how do you publicise an online platform? If you're doing an LSE event, you put it on the website. If you're doing and you tweet about it. If you've got a new master's programme, you put it in a prospectus. If you're doing an online crowdsourcing platform, well, how do you get people to know that it's going on?
It's building on what Paul has said. My experience of people engaged in this kind of pressure group work, they have a view which is about the substance, but their main view is about not being involved. And so if you draw people into being involved, they don't mind being beaten.
Yeah.
So quite a lot of these people are thrilled to be engaged, even if at critical points I tell them they haven't got a chance, because there's a certain dignity in being part of something, even where you lose. And their main anxiety often is that they never get a chance to speak. And that worked quite well, I think, for the, to take a few of them, the Republicans and the monarchists and the animalists and so on.
Friends of the Earth.
To be part of the show.
But they didn't.
Mattered more than winning.
But they did and they didn't agree on that in the end, because when it came to the convention at the end, where we actually took these drafted elements and in different areas of potential constitution, people stood up in a room a bit like this and said, on the subject of head of state, this group has seen all the evidence coming on the platform and we decided it's a republic.
Yes.
And of course, when that came to be reported, the monarchist guy, whose name I've forgotten, Ian Roberts, I think.
Yeah, Ian Roberts.
So said, I can completely see that's what's happening on this platform, but I know that if you ask the people of the Britain at large, that's not what the British public wants. They don't want a republic, they want a monarchy.
Yeah.
So they're willing to be defeated in that context, but they don't then accept, perhaps legitimately, that is a national result.
Yeah, no, they can't.
So,
they can't, without crumbling into oblivion.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, there were pros. I suppose there were pros and cons to that engagement, weren't there? We ended up with, I think, 10 or 11 prompt statements provided us by the interest groups that aligned them, that were happy to participate in the project. And this was great, actually. I think Mike Sharples has highlighted a couple of times that with the advent of these kind of large open social projects, the softening of the initial environment for participants is terribly, terribly important. What this did was to give us some foundation content which people could initially respond to without us being terribly present, so helping us to avoid the idea that this is a course and we're trying to give you an education here. This still gave that room for the community to immediately take ownership of the project, which was really, really important. But it did kind of give us a problem in another respect, in that all of these groups publicised the project through their own social media channels, through their own publicity, brought to the project a certain amount of their membership, some more than others, and that was clearly reflected in the Head of State Challenge, whereby we had an episode where I think mid-February Republic tweeted out about the project, and within 24 hours we had 150 new users. At a time when we were still building the community, we had, I think around that time, like 500 users on the platform.
Yeah.
So, all of this sudden influx from one group gave a bit of a skew to the conversations, and that took a little bit of time for that effect to kind of fade away. But
I think you talk about that's actually quite a good point, talking about the notion of citizenship opening up to both individuals and to collective groups and to special interest groups. There's been a lot of debates in the UK around opening up citizenship, and clearly in the Scottish referendum, 17 and 18-year-olds are allowed to vote. That's quite a contentious issue around the EU referendum about allowing 17 and 18-year-olds to vote. Yet this project was entirely open and accessible. You didn't stop people from non-UK citizens from participating. There was no age barrier to this. So for me, what are the challenges and the benefits of this kind of open approach? Anyone want to
Can I start with that?
Yeah,
because there was a nice moment in the first of the non-virtual, that is real events, where we were debating the pros and cons of a British constitution. Somebody put their hands up and said, 450 people in the room, said, how many people here are British? And I sort of said, okay, let's run with this. Hands up those who were British. And of course, the majority were not British. It was quite interesting. So there was a slight sense of vulnerability, but we got over that, and people forgot and so on. Really interesting point was, what's it for? And we were able to avoid concerns about enfranchisement by never saying that we intended this to be the British Constitution. It was an input in a debate about a British Constitution. So we anticipated bending the ear of Graham Allen, whom we met, who is an MP much interested in these matters, who was doing his own, excellent in some ways, constitution as part of the chair of a relevant committee. We envisaged a deputation to the Speaker. We never envisaged a coup where we imposed our constitution, though we're asked about the possibility, mainly by the foreign press. And so we were able to avoid issues of legitimacy by presenting ourselves as lively contributors to a debate, not definers of the outcome.
Forgive me for breaking into the pragmatic. One of the excellent reasons for not excluding anybody was we couldn't prove necessarily where they lived or how old they were.
Yeah.
So
Yes, that is very true.
So we can't exclude. We say, well, we don't believe that you're 18.
Yeah.
Well, we haven't got that kind of time for the number of participants that we're talking about. Yeah. So there's a real pragmatic element to keeping it open, and of course a very excellent theoretical underpinning that Connor's just provided as well.
Of course, it was fascinating that the number one user had the username of John from Jersey.
Yes.
And the very first thought, we thought, oh, it's from Jersey.
Yeah.
No, he's actually from New
Jersey.
Jersey.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Which is quite interesting.
Yeah.
That also leads in, I think, to another
But
interesting...
he also made some, in terms of comparative constitutions, he actually made some, it was quite then instructive because it's a spark for debate. Over here we have this.
Yeah.
Well, that is really a starting point. Do we want that? Do we want that? Don't know. It then either gets a conversation going to have a point of comparison to so it wasn't an entirely negative or hijacking kind of contribution to have.
No, on the contrary, it was very useful. We had a number of contributions from British expats around the world who were able to provide and bring a really interesting, different perspective to the conversations. It was really good.
So one of the interesting things, of course, with online education is the fact that it's not a collective experience for a lot of people. Often it's a community of learners rather than a learning community. So they're participating by themselves. At the time they want to participate, they hope there's information there. I'd like to ask firstly about the way people entered the project. We talk about that sort of notion of there's a week one in a lot of courses. How did you see the way people participated in the course move? And then the second thing I'm interested in is that because it was quite open, did you think you had different types of participation that weren't just people putting ideas and comments? So were people learning on the platform by doing things other than typing stuff?
Yeah, right. So I suppose there are a few things that are defining characteristics about our project, or rather that set our project apart. We had a growing project right to the end. The growth curve for contributions and participation continued right to the end. And I think what this indicates to us clearly is that, not to extol the kind of efficacy of what we put in place, but but to say at the very least we were successful in removing some of the barriers to participation, so that right up until the end people were able to find themselves new entrants to a mature project that had already an awful lot of contributions, an awful lot of debate to navigate, yet they still felt comfortable and felt that there was a space for their own contributions. And I think that was really, really heartening. How we refine and improve that, I think, is an area for us to investigate further, and which we'd very much like to trial with a second project of this type. Go on, Paul.
Well, it seems to me it's easy, but not quite right, to measure the amount that people learn by the number of contributions they made in different forms, whether that's comments, whether it's new ideas or votes or whatever. It seems to me that every time somebody leaves a comment or puts forward an idea, they haven't copied and pasted that from somewhere where they already thought it.
Yeah.
They've probably thought about that, what they're writing, perhaps redrafted a couple of times. No, that's not quite what I mean. Rephrased what they mean, perhaps spoken to somebody else who's in their household or in their workplace, thought about it again, changed the idea. There's a whole discussion taking place that's invisible to the way that a platform like this records ideas. So there's a whole learning and discussion activity that we never see, and we don't know the scope and scale of.
Yeah.
So in terms of what they learn, it isn't just when there's an expert intervention or an expert video or a debate and votes and weighing up this and this argument against that argument. There's a whole invisible learning experience.
Paul really that very succinctly puts like an awful lot of my feelings about the current MOOC environment is that actually we are metric driven in evaluating MOOCs, but are the metrics the right ones? Like, because of the nature of delivery, it's an awful lot about engagement with resources. Did a video get watched? How many times? Did an MCQ get completed? Who downloaded these papers? And actually, none of that really encapsulates learning. I mean, in some instances, and with the right qualification, it can be indicative. But we, as some indication of sort of whether or not we delivered a successful learning experience, we surveyed our community at the end. We got out of a community of 1,500, some 50% of whom was still active within the final week. So out of 750 participants who were active in the final week, we got over 200 survey responses. Now, anyone involved in any kind of qualitative evaluations knows that getting that kind of response rate on a survey is itself something quite remarkable. But the way we chose to evaluate learning is to ask of our participants some key questions, and that is things like the extent to which other participants' contributions changed their mind, changed their perspective on certain issues, the extent to which they felt their experience on the platform had given them either A, new knowledge, or B, new skills. And it's building now on that framework of evaluating learning in these very, very informal online environments and experiences that I think is the area for concentration for us.
Connor?
There's a radical tension between making knowledge and learning knowledge. You know, the ESRC promote and drive co-production of knowledge. But in a university, you've gone to an awful lot of trouble to know more than other people. So how do you manage that tension? And this project did it in the following way. It presented itself as the co-production of a constitution, which means we all started equally and we all produced an outcome which we owned. But actually, it was a sophisticated learning environment. Darren has used the language of learning. So under cover of the appearance of co-production was in fact a lively, flexible learning experience, both from the professor and his team, the guru, but also from each other, virtually and in real circumstance. So it was a classy way of getting people to grow intellectually without necessarily making them the equivalent of everybody else. Respect, but not equivalence. And that was the beauty of it, actually. In the end, the product mattered less than the process.
I think that's actually a key question, because when we've talked a lot, and I've jokingly referred to Connor as the guru of the project. For you, as the kind of, the if you will, coming into this before we started, the lead academic voice
Yes.
on this, And knowing that in a lot of these online programs, one of the things that make it is the sort of star academic, the kind of rock-academic voice that's in there. How did you feel about the sort of changing role, and what did you think your changing role as the sort of lead academic?
Well, I'm obviously disappointed, you know. In its original design,
You wanted the lights,
it was me,
yeah.
and millions of people queuing up to hear me.
To you, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you know, that chap from Harvard, whom they're obsessed by. What's his name? Mr. Sandel.
Yeah.
Was, of course, my goal in life, and that failed lamentably. But so did the CD discs where that had been the case. We sold, I think, one of the 25,000 that we made. So if any of you are interested in that, it's a little out of date.
He's signing outside.
It's in John Norton's garage in Madingley. So how did I feel about it? I thought it was a fantastic thing that we were ahead of that rather conventional approach. And we were not in the game of creating a lecture theatre for the world. We were in something much more ambitious, which was about a collective production which produced learning through the appearance of production. So I took a back seat largely. I was not really part of the range of decisions about which you've heard up to now, and that was as it should be. The project would have failed if I regarded myself as somebody with a knowledge that would allow me to engage on these decisions about the platform, etc.
So the interesting question, I guess, for both Paul and Darren, who observed a lot of this on a daily basis, were the participants looking for that privileged voice? Because that's the traditional model of education. You know, were they seeking that voice to sort of reinforce their decisions?
Well, there is from our evaluation, there is a curious sort of finding, which is that as much as Connor took that kind of less, but not less present, but it certainly wasn't, you know, a lecture every day and a seminar every day. There were, you know, weekly opportunities for participants to engage with different types of content that were being delivered. So they would see Connor interviewing a whole variety of people that were constitutional law experts, but also from within the project. You know, a number of our facilitators, a couple of our facilitators were interviewed. By far and away, participants will have had significantly more engagement and contact with the facilitators on the project. But their evaluation, what came through in the evaluation was that they still placed a huge amount of value on Connor's role in the project, as much as we tried to sort of move that out. And in actual fact, as much as I say we tried to downplay the educational aspects, one of the other questions we asked in the evaluation was what expectations did you have about this being an educational offering? And 80-odd% of participants said we've got educational expectations, even though we didn't pitch it like that. So as much as we sort of try to shake it off, and
we are LSE.
Yeah, we can't completely rid ourselves of the idea that we're trying to educate people, even if we go out there with a project which doesn't mention teaching, qualifications, credit, anything like that.
I think the analogy is to watching a sports programme. So you can watch the match and think, well, I know what's going on, that's happening, this is the tactic here, this is happening. And then a lot of people still want to hear at half-time or between the innings exactly what's happened from somebody who understands the game, understands the sport in a practical way, or has more expertise than the average viewer does. I mean, they don't want to hear that all the time. They don't want every element of this learning experience to be Conor Gearty says this is what you should think on the House of Lords reform. But they do want to know from time to time what are the different arguments that are out there, because most people don't spend a lot of time thinking about constitutional issues. So they need some prompts, they need some pointers.
But I don't think I ever revealed any personal perspective at all on it.
No.
But even whether I thought there should be a written constitution, I don't think there's a single item in the millions of words which says I think it's a good idea.
I accept that, although leading a project about writing constitution might give away something of what you think of the idea. But I think. But I think people still want the prompts. They want to know what the arguments are. They want to know what the options are.
This is actually a good opportunity to open up to questions from the floor as well. As we are recording, if you have got a question, please put your hand up and I'll give you this wonderful microphone. Oh, right at the back there, sir.
Hi, I'm Lauren from LSE. I'm interning in the LTI team, And I was wondering, you keep on referring to your community, but do you have any kind of knowledge as to what your demographics are in that community? So who was targeted, or rather not targeted, but who participated in the project?
As much as possible through our promotion of the project, through social media, through to more traditional channels as well, we tried to reach as broad a base as we possibly could. Now, the demographics for participants in the project are varied, and in some instances are not what we would have expected at all. There is an age bias. So overwhelmingly, we did not engage youth sufficiently around this project. So there is definitely a skew, and it's worth taking that into consideration. There was also a gender bias in the project, which I think all of these biases, I think we were all a little bit disappointed about. But they are what they are. We tried to address them as best we could through the course of the project. To some extent, we were able to improve the situation with some demographics and not others. We were looking at a kind of 65-35 gender split, male-female. This isn't completely unheard of in online environments, but nevertheless, it's disappointing that we couldn't do better than that. And then the regional distribution. As much as there were physical events located around the country, there was still a bulk of engagement from England compared with the other regions. And why that is an area for further investigation for us.
And any other questions? Yep, over here.
I'm Alison Corney. I'm an independent academic consultant. I'm fascinated by this, and it's really very inspiring. Thank you. Had I been in your place, I think I would have been slightly concerned about bringing together large numbers of people from different disciplines, different areas, who may not share the same language. I don't mean English, French, etc. I'm meaning the language to express concepts, the language to express ideas, because we are talking about a fairly specialist area of knowledge here. Was there and I think what I would have been concerned about was actually people trying to express what might be the same idea using very different terms, using terms that are not typically used in the way that they were being used, etc. And so there's a sort of an edginess of people really not understanding what was going on. Did you find that was the case? And if so, how did you address it?
I completely agree with you. And I think this is one of the fundamental risks of the project, that we're trying to combine people with unknown levels of pre-existing knowledge and expertise, which comes with its own lexicon, its own set of terms and ideas. It was a concern, but then if we're going to be put off by that concern, then the project fails. So it's kind of, we acknowledge it and we have to carry on. Actually, in practice, I don't think it was such a problem as we might have all feared it could have been at the outset. And I think part of that is due to the fact that we attracted a generalist audience. There was some expertise there, of course, in their expert interventions, but they're used to translating specialist knowledge into a usable format, if you like. The other thing is that we had this team of facilitators, and I think this is absolutely crucial, and perhaps we haven't done them enough justice in the talk so far, and so let's rectify that by saying that without this team of facilitators, each of whom had an area of discussion that they were facilitating and moderating, introducing new topics, linking topics up across discussion threads, translating, saying, it's interesting you think that, this compares, don't forget there's this person here with this idea, link them up, comment on each other. Without that going on, I think a lot of the links between the different ideas that came out in the ideation phase in particular would have been lost. And they are, in some ways, it's not the three of us here, particularly me, who are, to go cliched for a moment, the founding fathers of this constitution. It's those facilitators, I think, who have really with a key infrastructural point. Darren, I don't know if you want to pick up.
Yeah, I mean, Paul's absolutely right. In terms of the way that we were going to manage that open ideation phase, I think very early on we said this was about values. This is not trying to get people to come up with constitutional clauses from the off, and we certainly didn't want a project that was full of people doing their best to give us legalese or what they thought to be legal language. It was about values. The facilitators that we had 2 working in pairs across each of our 10 challenges. They were given a very, very clear brief about what they were there to do and what they weren't there to do. They weren't there to teach, and they weren't there to try and educate the crowd. They were there as a resource as and when the crowd wanted to make use of them, and they were there to take a light touch approach to reminding people, if required, of our code of conduct on the platform. Mercifully, that wasn't necessary, and that is a really interesting aspect of the project. We didn't have to deal with any instances of behaviour apart from literally less than a handful through the course of the 14 weeks. The job that they did, I think, was fascinating in that we stumbled across something interesting. We made this opportunity available to LSE students, postgrads, third year undergrads, to take this role in the project. They have at the same time, it recognises that they are at that stage, they have a good level of domain knowledge, which is very, very useful and highly applicable in a project of this type. But I think we might have stumbled across something that is interesting from a MOOC perspective. And the core question remains with MOOCs, despite the successful numerous rounds of funding that the major platform providers continue to attract, is what do they bring back to the institution? And I think we might have stumbled across something interesting in the role that we gave our students as facilitators. It was a really valuable teaching experience for them that gave them an opportunity to stretch their legs and put into practice in a real world scenario some of the learning that they've acquired while they've been here. And that was really interesting. And Paul's absolutely right. They were critical to the success of this project.
I think, just adding from my own perspective as an academic, I feel quite strongly about this actually. Failure to communicate to a wider audience is more often indicative of a failure to understand the subject you're seeking to communicate than it is any failure on the part of the person receiving the information. I really believe that. Really, really good people who are on top of their field can explain their field. People who are not on top of it hide behind jargon, are uncertain in their communication. So I'm not sure that any academic who isn't any good cannot communicate generally. Now, at a personal level, I have a lot of experience writing in newspapers and doing TV interviews, and they're very good training for academics because they get you in the zone of being able to communicate to people who are not necessarily fully informed before they hear you. And part of the job I had on this project, as I said, I wasn't really presenting my own point of view at all, was in functioning as a kind of friendly draw out of the points of view of other people so that I could be mindful of the possible slip into jargon or inexperienced lunge into specialism and keep them kind of on a track, which meant their communications were credible and engaging to those who heard them. So we ended up having very little trouble with that. I think mainly also we need to remember the Constitution is not a hard subject to communicate. So it's not sort of a field of intense jargon, and you don't need an awful lot of background knowledge to be able to understand it. It's not sort of monetary targets or sort of inflation or even complicated aspects of social policy. So our field wasn't as hard as it might have been.
Hi, Fiona Strawbridge from UCL. You've used the students then as these facilitators.
Yes.
How many students from the LSE do you think participated? Or do you have any idea? Do you know?
We do offhand. I don't have that information to hand, and I wouldn't want to speculate. We do have that. It's not something we've had a great deal of interest in looking at particularly, but it certainly isn't significant numbers. We don't have a student skew to the platform. It was overwhelmingly a public project, but there was not a significant amount of participation from LSE students as other than their role as facilitators in the platform. So those 20 that we enrolled.
Did you try and push it to the LSE student community or not? I mean, you
No.
weren't really bothered about that then?
I tried to make my students do it.
Yeah. And did they?
Yeah, a bit. Not hugely, you're right, not hugely.
No. I was sort of wondering whether you could take something like this and have it as a student-focused thing, or was its value in the external you know, the very broad community. I mean, I can't help thinking that this would be fantastic as, you know, some kind of an introductory activity for new students to help them to think in a different way and to work together.
I love the fact that it's external facing. I love the fact that primarily that was what it was all about, and I think some of the more recent work in the MOOC spaces has been around this notion of hybridity, but the manner in which it's manifested itself up to this point is pretty pedestrian, in the sense that it just means that you have registered students and members of the public enrolled in the same sort of traditional course. I think what we, and I say this is not designed in, what we stumbled across by recruiting our students in the facilitator role is something that actually contests this idea of hybridity and actually comes up with something a lot more interesting, which is how can you deliver a unique experience to your own students and at the same time engage the public. And I think for that reason it has to be external facing, and so it's incumbent upon us now to continue to ideate similar projects that allow such a methodology to be used, I think.
Carl Allen, I'm a member of the public. How do we know that trolls, some trolls at least, aren't necessary, though undesirable, element of the exercise?
Anyone want to take that one?
Well, I mean, it was a real concern from the beginning. I think is that a very great many of these similar kind of exercises do unfortunately get railroaded by trolling behaviour of a certain, almost always, minority of participants. I can honestly say through the course of 14 weeks there were less than 5 cases where our facilitators brought to our attention behaviour that they were concerned about on the platform. And when you consider that we had some 1,500 people, nearly 30,000 comments traded around these ideas, that is such a small amount that that I think the crowd very, very quickly got to a level whereby they were comfortable. I don't like to use the word self-policing, although I think it communicates exactly what they did, but they were very, very good at setting for themselves the tone of the engagement, what they as a community were happy with. And I think that yielded really great results. We didn't have to deal with, as I say, more than 4 or 5 cases through the whole of the project.
Yeah, and I think as well, related to that, there can be a fine line between something that's clearly trolling and somebody who's being provocative with an idea that they might actually believe or half believe, or they think is worth proposing. So I think that there is a judgment in what constitutes trolling and what is just provocative discussion, especially in something as fundamental as a constitution.
Yeah.
And I think you just have to sort of navigate that as and when those instances come up. And as Darren said, they're incredibly few and far between given the scope and scale of the project. And so I don't think it was a problem. I think we just sort of found our way through it, and the crowd found their way through it. As crowds typically, if you watch them in terms of actual physical crowds, they do find their way from place to place. So slightly reassuring about human nature in that respect, actually.
To wrap this up, I'm going to offer our panellists a brief opportunity to say, what next?
Right, can I start?
Yeah, of course you can, Connor.
What's next for me? I'm writing a book for Oxford University Press, relevant to say, called On Fantasy Island, which is about Britain, Europe and the Human Rights Act. Because the only way you can understand the absurd government position is regarded as a product of fantasy. But it's not. I'm trying to get Oxford to understand it's not really a book. So I'm creating a new website, which will link from my website. And Oxford have agreed that they will allow 20% of the book onto the website in advance. And I'm working with Paul and the IPA, and maybe you guys, we haven't talked about this, for some sort of interaction. And so I'm going to publish the book in bite-sized chunks on a weekly basis. And then people are going to be able to respond to the book, and I'll be able to respond to them on a sort of on-the-run way. So the emails will come to them, but will be seen by the community. So I'm trying to work through this idea that I know more than you guys, but please let me know what you think, and carrying the spirit of this project into something which is more traditionally a book. I'm not convinced Oxford University Press are ready for all this. I don't think traditional presses fully understand yet what Matt Lingard, who was used to be here, said to me about my previous project, which I had thought would be a book, and OUP wanted to have oversight of it on a monthly basis to make sure it wasn't silly. Matt said the product is in the web. The product isn't something which the web produces. The product is the web. But this is going to be a conventional book which will be kind of sort of grow through the web. So that's what's next for me.
Darren?
I am hugely keen to continue our evaluation research in this area. I think we're very lucky being positioned within a social sciences institution whereby we work across a range of departments whose research outputs mean so much to the public and public life. And I think it lends itself very much and very readily to the types of activity-led public engagement that we pursued on this Constitution UK project. I think for me personally there is something really interesting about the experience we were able to deliver for our own students in their role as facilitators on this project, and that's something I'd like to explore further. And I think this is a project which through its nature generated a huge amount of data from the community, and I think there are interesting opportunities to align the research interests of colleagues around the school with a valuable teaching experience for LSE students and public engagement exercises of just this type that put universities back at the heart of their communities.
What next? I don't know, but I suggest we give ourselves more than 14 weeks, because that that really wasn't the most pleasurable element of this project. International is the obvious, deliberately so, not picking up John from New Jersey, but something that's deliberately international in scope and in its public engagement is the most obvious thing. What that is, whether we think we can identify a global issue on which we want to attract engagement across the world, how we do that given the differential ability to engage technologically in different regions of the world, I think is a major obstacle or challenge. But in terms of internationalisation, it's interesting that we were, and offer this as a final thought, we were contacted by a guy from Sciences Po, one of LSE's partner institutions, called Nicolas Rousselier, who I believe is spending some time at LSE in the near future.
Oh, yeah, I've met him. Yeah.
Oh, you've met him? Yeah. And he effectively wants to do the same for France. Yeah. Create a new constitution for, I guess, a sixth French Republic, which sounds like a brilliant way to export this.
I have 2 French speakers in my team. We're fine.
So it's fine.
It's all good.
Can I ask
Over to you then.
Can I?
Yes.
I know this is the last point, but this is a really critical thing for me. I might as well put it on the table. Do you need academic players to make this work? Because we talk about LSE as an institution, as though it was unnecessary to have academics. My experience is that you need academics, all of your institutions. Now, is there a whole stable of people who will do what I did last year that you can call on? Because it is exhausting. It took an amazing amount of time. You have to be there all the time and everything. Are there a whole bunch of these academics who will do this when you plan for the future, international, new environments, or what?
I think the responsibility is on us to eke out and make very clear the opportunities that reside in these projects. They can generate an interesting amount of research data because of their public nature, because of their online data. They generate a huge amount of metrics. There are colleagues doing this in dedicated centres, so the Berkman Institute, Dana Boyd and colleagues doing dedicated research on social media as a data source. But I think building that into practice here within the departments, I think we have to make that argument and evidence it on the back of projects like this. And I think we have to be persuasive about the unique experiences we can provide to our students as part of these projects. Because one of the areas where MOOCs continue to fail to persuade me, at the very least, is what they offer in terms of return on investment for the institutions participating.
Yeah.
And on that note, I know Connor has a next engagement to go to. He's a busy man, so I will.
I have to do a graduation. That's all.
That's okay.
Can I just say, Paul's already alluded to it, but there is absolutely no way that this project would have delivered what it did over the 14 weeks were it not for the contributions of our 20 facilitators, from other colleagues within the Learning Technologies and Innovation team who aren't here today, Chris Fryer and Malta Werner, who is no longer with the LSE, but their contributions were huge. And within the IPA as well, our colleagues Noita Sadler and Daniel Regan, an absolutely phenomenal experience working with them, and a fantastic team to work with on this
It was the most exciting team activity I've ever done in academic life.
Yep.
And that's what we keep hearing from all the people involved.
And everybody knew what they were supposed to do, and nobody crossed over demanding ownership of anything they didn't know anything about. That was really fantastic.
Very positive. So if you are interested in more about these projects, we've got a bunch of stuff on the web at the moment around different presentations we've done. There's stuff on SlideShare, there's stuff on our LSE blog, which is blogs.lse.ac.uk/LTI. There's a whole lot of stuff that around. But at this point, I'd like you to thank Connor, Darren and Paul for their contributions today.
Thank you.
And finally, just a very small piece of self-promotion. We have our next NetworkED in 2016, which is Bonnie Stewart from the US talking about Twitter, which there's some flyers on the table, so please register for Eventbrite. Thank you very much for coming, and all please take some more coffee and biscuits.